now that we have our background and we have all of our different senses and systems all put together, let's start putting it all together. And we're going to be mostly looking at cognition and vision because we're such visual creatures. This is why I like to wrap up by talking about our visual system, because it seems to have lots of effects with other aspects of psychology. So we're going to start putting some of this together. Now, we've gone on and on about how our brains are doing all of these amazing things. So they're interpreting different cues and making sense of what's coming in, and sort of making these assumptions and shortcuts and making use of information that we're perceiving. And when our brains are doing this, they can have two different broad approaches. The first of these approaches is the bottom-up processing. So this is, you're looking at something and you're going to start by looking at the individual elements that make that thing up. So you start with the little bits and pieces. What color is it? What size is it? What shape is it? And so you put together all of those little pieces to put them together and interpret the object as a whole. Maybe if you see something and it's orange and it's round and it's kind of smooth with a little bit of a bumpy surface, you would interpret it as an orange. And so this bottom-up processing emphasizes the fact that the individual stimulus characteristics of an object are really important in allowing you to recognize that object. And so if we think of this as a bottom-up process, we start at the bottom with all of the details, all of the little factors that are making up the thing we're looking at, and we can think really hard about all of those things coming together to get us to identifying what it is that we're looking at. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, that's an awful lot of processing to be going on. By looking at an orange and having to consider the color and the shape and the texture and all of these things, that can't be how our brains work all the time. And in fact, it's not. We have another way of processing, which is our top-down processing. And this is where our brains do that thing that they're so good at, and they can form shortcuts. So they can interpret our incoming sensory information specifically in the light of things that we already know, our existing knowledge, the concepts that we've already formed, and ideas that we're aware of. So in these cases, when we're using top-down processing, different contextual factors and our expectations can affect how quickly we recognize an item. So a great example of top-down processing is if you look at this sentence at the bottom, and it says, "The man ran." But if we look at what we've interpreted as an H here, the exact same shape has been interpreted as an A elsewhere. So we took the context of what other letters are around and what words make sense, and we kind of filled in those gaps. So our top-down processing gave us an advantage because it let us gloss over some missing information and make an assumption that helped us make sense of something that would probably confuse us if we were using bottom-up processing. If we were trying to figure out what shape this is, we might be thrown by the fact that these sides are turned in a little bit like an A, but the top is open like an H. So there's a problem. But top-down processing saves us by helping us interpret that information. And so you can guess that top-down processing is especially strong and useful when a stimulus is only seen very, very briefly, or if the stimulus is incomplete or ambiguous. So top-down processing is how we make use of incomplete information, or how we fill in the gaps if we don't have the time to properly evaluate what it is we're seeing. So another example down here is if you read from top to bottom, we see A, B, C. But if we read from left to right, we see 12, 13, 14. So again, this ambiguous shape in the middle can be interpreted two different ways depending on the context that we're viewing it in. And this top-down processing is phenomenal for humans. It lets us make really quick decisions, interpret things very quickly, and it helps us fit information in with stuff that we already know. We should keep in mind, though, that top-down processing can lead us to make some inaccurate conclusions. So maybe you assume that you're seeing one thing because it makes sense in the context, but if you don't pay a lot of attention to it, maybe you miss something. And that's why we have this picture of Where's Waldo up in the top corner here, where to find Waldo in one of his books, you have to use this bottom-up processing. You have to break it down into, okay, I need to find something with red and white stripes that are this particular shape in this particular orientation, because if you just relied on top-down processing, you'd only really be looking at the big picture. So bottom-up processing, as much as it's slower and it seems a little bit clunkier, it allows us to function in situations where we really need to pay attention or where we need to pick apart what it is we're looking at. So one isn't better than the other. Both are useful in different situations. Now, when talking about this sort of top-down interpretation and looking at the bigger picture, that's all going to apply to a field of psychology called gestalt psychology. And gestalt psychology focuses on the idea that humans have very basic tendencies to actively organize and interpret the thing that they're seeing. So human perception tends to see things where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So basically using that top-down perspective. And so when we talk about a gestalt, which is what gestalt psychology is named after, we're saying that a gestalt has an overall quality that is, it transcends the individual elements, or it means more to us than the individual components mean on their own. And a fantastic example of this is our perception of the human face. So at the top here, I have an oval with two lines. Now, it's just an oval and two lines. But as humans, our mind kind of looks at that and goes, yeah, that's kind of face-shaped. And in fact, we actually have part of our brain that actively lights up whenever we see something that fits the general structure and shape of a face. So this registers as face-ish. And our brains are just really good at picking that up. So we interpret this as a face, even though it's just an oval and two lines. So we're interpreting it as having more meaning, there's more to it than just what we're seeing. And in terms of this organization and categorizing the things that we're perceiving, humans also have this really good way of deciding if something is a figure or the background. So when we talk about a figure-ground relationship, we're looking at what is the focal point, what is the thing that I'm supposed to focus on, what is the figure, and what is in the background, what is less important, what can I pretty much ignore. So humans are really good at focusing on figures, but we do that at the expense of getting detail from the background. And this leads us to the problem of encountering ambiguous or difficult to interpret images where we don't know what the figure is and what the background is. So for example, this image here, is it two faces very close together? Or is it a cup on a black background? And our brain can't decide which one is the figure and which one is the background. And so we'll flip-flop back and forth. Sometimes we see faces, sometimes we see a cup, and back and forth as our brain can't decide what it is that we're seeing. So some other examples of figure ground relationships that are a little bit more ambiguous get us into the range of more optical illusions. So is this a young French woman looking away? Or is it an old woman with her hair covered with a scarf? Is this a picture of a face? Or is it someone walking in a woodsy environment? So we can see both, and our brain will flip between seeing one or the other. It changes which one it thinks is the figure and which one is the background. And that swap, that difference in which one we're focusing on at any given time, is called a gestalt reversal, where our brain can't quite seem to figure out what it's supposed to be seeing, so it sees both, one after the other. And we can use a bottom-up or top-down approach when we're trying to explain what's happening in these reversals. If we go bottom-up in our explanations, if we start by focusing on sort of the individual components, we might say that the neurons in our visual cortex have become adapted or used to seeing one figure, so it switches and it becomes easier to see the alternative. Or we could look at it top down and we can say that people are actively trying to solve that visual paradox. So we are consciously switching between which one is the figure and which one is the background, trying to figure out which of the two solutions is correct. And both are probably happening. So we're not saying that one or the other is correct. It's just two different ways we can look at what's going on. And so this gives us a very awesome opportunity to start talking about optical illusions, because it's going to give us some insight into how we perceive things in our environment. And a lot of this is based on that gestalt psychology. So humans are really good at seeing boundaries that aren't really there. So we'll form illusory contours in sort of this attempt to make sense of the world around us. So when we look at these images, you might see 4 Pac-Man shapes facing the center of the page, or maybe you interpret it as a yellow circle on top of 4 different blue squares. Both might be right. The reason why we tend to assume that those shapes continue comes from this assumption of how things should look. So we have these unconscious assumptions that our environment is logical and it makes sense. So if we look at these 2 rectangles, our mind tells us that we are far more likely in the real world to encounter 2 rectangles where the purple one is just closer to us and it is occluding or blocking our view of the orange one behind. But if we thought about it, maybe we happen to be standing at the exact right point where there's a purple rectangle and an orange L shape. And we just happen to be lined up where all we see is them perfectly together like that. So our likelihood principle, this idea that what should we encounter more often in the real world, tells us that this is probably 2 overlapping rectangles and not some coincidental encounter with perfectly positioned L shapes. And that's the same reason why we interpret this as a yellow square on top of these 4 circles, because we'd probably be a lot more likely in nature to encounter shapes on top of each other as opposed to perfectly aligned little Pac-Man wedges to produce that shape. And so with our brains more inclined to see what we would expect to see in nature, our interpretations of some things follow some very predictable paths. And we can break those predictable rules down into the Gestalt laws of organization. And these are all going to be fairly logical groupings of objects. So the law of similarity is doing just what it sounds like. Things that are similar are probably related. So if we see something that looks very similar to something else, our brains make this automatic association or assumption that those things go together. So if we look at the bottom here, we see a whole bunch of small circles, all organized into a triangle. And then we see these three larger circles that are making their own triangle. So we've grouped them where the small circles are one thing and the large circles are something else. As opposed to saying that we're seeing a star shape, we're saying that there are two triangles because we've grouped them based on similarity. We also have the law of proximity, where we assume that things that are close together in space probably go together. So we see three groups of two because we assume that these groups mean something. And we can think about this from the evolutionary point of view, where if you see things close together in nature, then maybe they're related. If you see a seed on the ground, maybe you see an acorn, then it's probably underneath the tree that it fell from. So you're probably looking at an oak tree. So that proximity means something. We have our law of closure, which kind of goes along with our illusory contours, where if there's a gap, we tend to just assume that there's some missing information. And with our top-down processing, we just fill in that gap. We fill in what we assume is missing. So we would see this as a circle as opposed to just a C shape. And then the last law is the law of continuity, which is the idea that we're a lot more likely to see things that have a continuous flowing pattern than something abrupt and jarring. So what we're probably seeing here is a line that goes from A to B and a different line that goes from C to D. It's probably not sort of this wedge shape that goes from A to C and from D to B. We're more likely to see that continuity of those flowing lines. And so these are some of the ways that our brains tend to try and organize our information. So our next thing to talk about is continuing along this same pathway. So these are going to be some perceptual constancies. So the idea that we make some assumptions based on what we're seeing. And so for the first, our shape constancy, we're basically saying that things don't spontaneously change shape. We're probably just looking at it from a different angle. So the idea here is if you look at your friend face on, if you're looking at them from the front, they're going to look very different than if you looked at them from the side, if you looked at them in profile. Their face is a completely different shape, but your brain understands that they're the same person. The shape hasn't changed, you're just looking at it from a different angle. So we understand that shapes aren't really going to change dramatically, we're just looking at them from a different angle, and that's changing our perception. We also have the size constancy. So if you think about the fact that things that tend to be closer to you will be larger than things that are further away. And again, our brains make some assumptions, they fill in some blanks based on this knowledge that things that are closer appear larger, but aren't actually larger. So the example here is, as you're walking towards your car, on your retina, the car starts taking up more and more space. But you know that the car is not growing, it's not getting bigger, you're just getting closer to it. And then our last one is the brightness constancy. And this is the idea that our perception of objects changes based on how they're lit. So your jacket might look like it's gray when it's in bright sunlight, but it might look black when you're inside and in dim light. But we know that your jacket isn't spontaneously changing colors, we're just seeing it in different lights. And so, of course, there are some really cool visuals to help illustrate some of these concepts. So for size constancy, we look at this and we see two men sitting in a hallway, and we know that the one that is further back is further back. And in our mind, we're like, yeah, he's a little bit smaller, but that's just because he's back further. But if we take this guy out of his context, if we move him away from what we're seeing as the whole picture, if we cut him out and move him forward, all of a sudden we realize just how much smaller he is on the screen. But in our minds, we just said, no, it's size constancy. They're both human sized. He's just further away. So it's surprising how much smaller he is, and we don't realize it until we move him. And of course, we can play with some of these constancies and some of these rules of perception, and that's how a lot of our optical illusions exist. So our perceptual constancies give us this idea that if we can manipulate the context, we can manipulate the environment that we're seeing that thing in. If we can take the small man from his point in that environment, we can mess with how we see things. So we can use converging lines to disrupt our idea of size constancy. So in this example here, we have a room that's been constructed, and they're using these lines on the floor where we assume that those are straight lines and that they're running as we would expect them to run. And the room is normal sized room. So this must be a small human, and this must be a giant human. But if I click to the next slide, you can see how the trick is done, where we assume that the tiny human is standing at this point here, but in fact, we've used very specific illusions and techniques and different ways the lines work to make us think that a person that's standing further back is actually up closer and disrupting that size constancy. And if I come back here, we have that linear perspective here that's telling us that this is further back in space, which makes us think that this line must be larger because it's further back. So this line feels bigger. But in fact, this line and this line are exactly the same height. So a lot of those standard optical illusions you've been exposed to operate because we can manipulate our perception and play with some of the ways that our brain tries to make shortcuts. So most of these illusions are going to exist because of our monocular depth cues. It's very, very difficult to use binocular depth cues. As we saw with our real world example, there are ways that you can do it in the real world, but this is still mostly using those converging lines and linear perspective that we get from our monocular depth cues. But we can also see things like the impossible triangle and the impossible staircase and our devil's tuning fork. These are all illusions that can only work in 2 dimensions on a piece of paper because of how we visualize those things. So it's a lot easier to fool the brain with 2 dimensions than it is with 3, but 3 is possible if you're careful.